For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end. On the throne of David and on his kingdom.
I wonder how long that goes on for. That was a little longer than normal. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. We're continuing on the book of Colossians here. We're at the end of chapter 3. We talked extensively about family relationships and the right order of them. You know, these days people don't understand the importance of hierarchy and the importance of, well, even the very idea of being under a lord or under anyone. And it's it's an interesting contradiction in human nature. While at the same time, people don't have a concept of lordship in their lives the way they used to, coming out of the medieval and periods where they were under true lords. That's right. Not that they were true men, but they were actual lords with actual power over them and over their lives. But at the same time, though at least in the society I grew up in, America, we were, the independence spirit rubbed off on me. And on many Americans, and Americans tend not to like authority and tend to not to want to be put under it. But also, as I've learned the past year, there's a tremendous amount of willingness to just submit to authority in order to, I guess, avoid taking responsibility for your own life. And that goes back to the book of Samuel, when they desired a king, and God gave them Saul. And he warned them that a king would not do all the good they hoped and would bring about many evils, but they wanted one anyways. And so, the idea of servants and masters is somewhat unpalatable, because we don't understand the idea of lords and such. And we think only in terms of master and slave. And I think this word means slave. I should check that real fast here. Oops. That's not how we do it. Excuse me. I didn't transfer it. Yeah, okay, there we go. There we go. Let's just bring it up. This is near the end of the chapter. Yeah, it's doulos, which means slave. Or is it doulos? It's doulos. I thought it was Dao, but it's just my ignorance. Doulos, properly someone who belongs to another, a bond slave, someone else's property. Now, I gotta say, in the times of the Bible, slavery could be brutal, depending on how you became a slave. Sometimes people, through criminal activity, became slaves, or through, and their sentence was like to go work in the salt mines. That usually was reserved for, as far as I know, for the worst offenders. General slavery, being owned by someone, could be bought out of, as it was in the modern time, well, in the antebellum South in America, but it took on a very nasty flavor. And some people don't like to admit that it was a little different in the South than it was historically. There was something a little worse about our slavery, and I was thinking about it. Because I've often pointed out how that the Bible has some interesting fugitive slave laws. If you look at Deuteronomy, I think it's 23:15. I got the wrong window up here. In Deuteronomy 23:15. There's you won't deliver to the master his servant which is escaped with from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee even among you in that place where he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best, thou shalt not oppress him. Runaway slaves were to be harbored. And I've often wondered questions about that particular verse, but we had a much more strict fugitive slave law, and even towards the end, a black man could be just compelled back into slavery, or a woman, or whatever. Even if he was free, if he was in the South unaccompanied or whatever, he would be presumed to be a runaway, or without proper papers or a pass. They used to have to get passes to move around. They couldn't move around freely. And I don't know to the degree which that was also part of Roman culture. But I do have a theory about why it probably was worse in America. It's not, racism has been around forever in all kinds of places. People always have a tendency to favor and disfavor people who are more alike or more different from themselves. I don't think that it was particularly more racist. Well, maybe so because, obviously because they enslaved they enslaved not an entire race, but entirely according to race. Even though there were some people with white skin who were slaves, they were part black, so they were, there was the one drop rule. Even one drop of, African blood made you black. And that's how they looked at it. I'm like, how far do you take that back? Because I don't know. I don't know where the drops begin and end. Anyways, but I think one of the reasons why it was probably worse is, people have often pointed out that they use the Bible to justify slavery. And you can use the Bible to justify all kinds of things. That's not a big deal. I mean, it's like, I can use it to justify slavery. It was also used to condemn slavery. In fact, the abolitionist movement was a very powerful Christian movement. It was motivated by Christian impulses. So whatever you want to say about the Bible and slavery, we could have that argument. But I think it is because the men who perpetrated the slavery were Christians. It was worse because they had to justify it to themselves, like why this was okay. And when you look for self-justification, you can justify. The Romans didn't care about human life. It was like human life. It was of very little value. They did, but it was like life of a citizen was important. But the life of a stranger was not. Someone who's not a Roman citizen wasn't afforded the same rights in the Roman Empire. They weren't. It's not that they had no rights; they just didn't have the same rights. Because they didn't pretend about humans being all created equal. It wasn't really an idea. And that idea comes in large part from Christianity, and it was never fully really realized for centuries, as far as like people didn't, the idea of actually having it permeate down in the culture to a society that was more Christian, that was trying to be more Christian maybe than previous ones had. It's not about government or anything, it's just about people. Well, in justifying this slavery, they had to dehumanize the slaves. They had to be less than human, because they knew all men were created equal. And so in some way in the South, there was a great deal of dehumanization and also, preventing them from being educated. Whereas the Romans, an educated slave was more valuable. This slave can read and write. Oh, good, he'll be my accountant. So there was a value. In the antebellum South, they wanted to keep them really uneducated. Even after slavery, especially after slavery, you might say. Because there were a lot of, and reading and writing isn't the only kind of skill you can have. It's like, I watched Roots. Maybe you're a great chicken breeder or something. I don't know. Or trainer. I don't know. But there are, or cook or whatever. There's all kinds of value that could be placed into a person besides reading and writing. But through the necessity, they had to dehumanize them because they couldn't deal with them as equals. And I think in some ways that's what made things worse. Because when people justify themselves and they try to justify their actions, which are wicked, and try to make themselves righteous, they can become capable of really horrible things. And I was just meditating on that. And whenever I talk about slavery, it always has to come up in some degree, because Paul says, servants, obey your masters. From Paul's perspective, slavery existed. He was preaching the gospel. It's not a question of right and wrong. It's a question of pragmatism. It is. And preaching to people in a hostile environment like Paul was, there's no profit to be had in saying, servants, throw off your chains. Plus, he knew that it's not that God can't use you. One time he says, if you could obtain freedom, then use that. If you can be free, then be free. But as long as you are a servant, as long as you are a slave, obey your masters in all things according to the flesh. Meaning as much as they own your body, you should obey them. And it's good advice because you can get in trouble disobeying. It's very difficult. I don't know of any. There was Spartacus who led a slave revolt, but that revolt was crushed. I don't know of many successful slave revolts except Haiti. And that's not really a great country right now. It never really manifested into a great country, but they freed themselves, and good for them. But if you find yourself in a position of bondage, Paul's perspective is like, you can still serve God. Yes, you have to serve your master. But, I've no doubt, in his mind, he thinks back to the patriarch Joseph, son of Jacob, son of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Sorry, I skipped Isaac there. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob had his 12 sons, including Joseph, second youngest by Rachel, right? And he was beloved. And his brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt. And when he went to Egypt, he was a slave, but he quickly ascended in the house he was placed by being really good at what he did. You know what I mean? Because, you find yourself in a position like that, you have several options. You can weep and cry about being a slave. You can submit to it and be rueful and difficult. And you will get, most likely you will just get beaten and whipped and hurt. And Paul's advice is not bad advice. Like, do a good job. Not with eye service, like, yes, it's like, but heartily. Singleness of heart, fearing God, as if you're working for God. As if unto the Lord. I wonder if heartily is like literally with your heart. I want to know. Inquiring minds want to know. Heartily. Ah, yes. From or out of. I think this is wrong. See, if I click on this, it gives me. It says the word is ek, which is the Greek preposition for out of or from. I'm assuming it says. I think it's literally from the heart. I think they just didn't link up a word there. This shows you. Is it ever translated heart? Let's find out. Because if it is, then that's an odd. Yeah, I don't see anything that looks like heart there in the translation. All the way down. This word it occurs a lot. It's from. Well, there it goes. Plus heartily. I know what the plus heartily. Whatever. Okay. Plus ek among forth up. I'm not sure when it says plus what that means in the Strong. So whatever. It's not critical. I was just curious if it was actually literally from the heart, which I thought it probably would be. But that's the basic idea, even if that's not an exact translation. Do it from the heart, as if you're doing it to the Lord. That's not so easy because men on earth are not like God. They're not as merciful. They're not as kind. They're not as understanding. Sometimes they can be understanding at least. I mean, I'm not going to say as, but men are they're less than God, obviously. But we can do well, and we have to have faith in the sense and fear God that if we're in a situation, we're in it for a reason, and if we can work our way out of it through faith, then praise be to God. It's not an easy thing. I don't think Paul's like just making light of it, but he's saying this is wisdom. He's not saying this because slavery is right. He's saying it because people sometimes fall into bad situations in which they have to know how do I navigate this space? How do I know what to do in this situation? I find myself a slave. Whereas I was free and they took me unjustly. They captured me. What do I do? And the best thing you can do is often just do a really good job as a slave. And it's a terrible truth of life. But even then, you can improve your situation. And especially in the Roman times, a man could, if he did well as a slave, that he could earn money eventually and buy his freedom. Many people did. But of course, you're never going to get there if you drag your feet and become difficult and you get sold off to the salt mines. Because you're an unprofitable servant. Slavery is a terrible institution, especially like I said. I do think there were characteristics in America that were somewhat different. I don't think it's like the greatest sin of all times or whatever. It's bad, but it is what it is. It was different. The fact you could pick them out by for the most part by race. A light-skinned slave. Someone born with all Caucasian features could probably escape and slip into society eventually, without anybody knowing it. All right. As unto the Lord, not unto men. Joseph, from the position of being made a slave, sold off by his brothers. He eventually rose to prominence in Egypt and even became the servant of Pharaoh himself and became powerful in the land, eventually saving his family from a famine. It took him a long time to get there. He had to play a really long game, and it got worse before it got better, because as he was doing a good job being a servant, he was doing such a good job, he caught the eye of his master's wife, who attempted to seduce him, and when she failed, she accused him of rape, and he wound up in prison. You imagine what happens to you have a high-placed guy, and you're his slave, and you try to rape his wife? It's a miracle that he was not immediately executed, except that perhaps, even in the movies, when they do that scene, they always make it seem as if Potiphar, who was his master, Joseph's master, as if there was some doubt. As if he had doubts as to his wife's truthfulness. Which makes sense, because otherwise why would he have not executed him immediately? For attempting to rape his wife. And in that society, that just, that would be, I think, pretty well, a slave tries to rape your wife. You don't even need to go to a judge. You just take him out and kill him. That's how that world worked. Such was the power. It's the power of the Me Too movement. Can get you killed, especially in those days. Knowing that the Lord shall receive the reward of the inheritance. That of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. It's like you gotta put it in perspective and say, like, look at, this is not a good situation, but I have to submit, and just whatever, I gotta make the most out of it. It's not bad advice to say make the most of the situation you're in. And remember, you serve Christ. And whatever you do, it's like ultimately God has your back. The Lord recently demonstrated this to me very powerfully. And it's kind of weird. But, that song, like that, the labor you do is not lost. It is not just wasted. Your life, even if it's, done because some people in our modern time will suggest that we're all slaves now. Slaves to the bankers, slaves to the internationalists, or that they look at us as slaves, as little cogs in their machine. Slaving away, working away from paycheck to paycheck just to exist. And I don't really agree with that sentiment because, if you knew anything about slavery, you would not compare it to life in America, even working a minimum wage job. Though I do see the point that, but I would argue that in many ways, all men are under some form of bondage. Not slavery, but a kind of bondage. And I've often said the king is servant to all his people. He has obligations. He must be the king. I've never discussed anything with a royal person, but in a sense, being that royal person is something that is hard for them to escape. Or, and sometimes they do escape it, by basically, back in the, just like 100 years ago in England, they had one of their king. I forgot which king, or he was he was going to be king, but he vacated, or I forgot what the exact word was, but he decided he wanted to live a normal life. He went and married a normal woman. He gave it up to live a normal life. Because if you want to keep that life, you can't be king and be commoner. You can't do both at the same. You can fake it, like a king can go about in beggar's clothes to see how his people live or something like that. But he can't be both king and commoner in his life. He must serve the people or be one who serves himself. And everyone, and a husband and a family. Husbands, love your wives. I didn't, I could have talked, when I talked about that, I didn't really talk, I talked mostly about I love them by, I talked a kind of a tough love angle because I feel that the other angle is obvious. I give my wife signs of affection and stuff and love her by doing good things for her and stuff like that. And that also counts. But there is, I've entered into a relationship, a marriage relationship at some point where I took vows and promises and, and heaped upon myself all these obligations. And then we had children and and though I could escape all of this, I could just be like, hey, you know what? Where's my cell phone? Where's my wallet? Where are my keys? Grab them and just jump in my truck and just drive away. Technically speaking, there's nothing keeping me here. And there's nothing keeping me here. I could just go. There's no physical impediment to my escape. But on the other hand, there are many things keeping me here. Many, many things. Those obligations and love and other things. And so there's like a chain. I in many ways, my life feels very much hemmed in. I have certain amount of autonomy, but many factors of my life are beyond my control. And people will look at that situation of the human condition and say, none of us are free. We can't be free. But that is a ridiculous standard. Because life is always going to be a struggle of some sort. And you're not, it's like the idea that somehow we could just make it so everyone lives like a king. No one ever has to labor hard. or produce anything. We'll just we'll just print up a bunch of money and send it out to everybody, so everybody has enough. And it's like, and then all the little things you want, no one will ever do. No one will work at a fast food joint. Why bother? Well, they won't need to because there's robots. Okay. Those robots are not as far as long as people think. They're very far from being able to do a lot of things people do. Sure, you can have a kiosk to order your food. You don't need that part of the person. Sure, your checker could be a thing, but they always have someone supervising it because machines. It's like they talk about AI doing stuff. I can't even check myself out at the Walmart without the thing having a problem. It's many times it goes fine, but a lot of times it's like, oh, something's wrong, the wrong price, and these systems are very imprecise and very, the intelligence of artificial intelligence is very low. People are telling me the robots are taking over. It's like, yeah, well, I'll believe it when I see it. We are far from that, the technology. And plus, I don't like to call myself a programmer, but I do some coding. And just because I don't want to insult programmers by putting myself in the same category with them, since I'm not really... I wouldn't well, I haven't taken it up as a profession exactly, let's put it that way. But the complexity that would go into artificial intelligence is very high, and we just don't have... computers are really good at doing certain things. It reminds me of the song I wrote last night. It's called Do You Believe in Science? And so, because the question kept coming up, do you believe in science? People keep saying this. Do you believe in science? So that's my new song I wrote last night. Do you believe in science? Yes, I believe in science. I believe in science like I believe in hammers. But not, and so if you can understand the logic where it goes from there, it's like a hammer is a tool. And there are many tools in life we have to use. You know what I mean? They're tools. And they're good for what they are. But, they can't do everything. Even so, I'm getting distracted a little bit. Because people, they don't want to be... They see themselves as wage slaves and stuff like that. Because they have to work 40 hours a week just to survive. But, in a free man in Roman times had to work 80 hours a week to survive. You know what I mean? It's not like it's our productivity is so much higher, and we're doing so much better. And to talk about people living in the richest country in the world and able to earn a living, and then with those earnings to spend it on themselves as they please for whatever hedonistic pleasures they desire, and access to all the entertainment, you have all the bread and circuses you want. What is the nature of the freedom you want? People want to be little gods floating around on clouds, having every whim met by a little flying baby or something. Brings them, oh yes, bring me the olives and the lunch meat. Yes, let's stuff ourselves with the good things. They want, oh yes, deliver me the sex on a silver platter. Yes, they want all the good, desirable, and lustful things of life just delivered to them. And they would have to do nothing for it. It would just appear, because why shouldn't they have it? They can't think of a single reason. They can't think of a reason why they shouldn't have all that their hearts desire. Or that they should have to work extraordinarily to get all their heart's desires. And I understand, it's like, in life, I can't say I obtained everything I thought I don't know, in life, what do I want? Well... It's not material things for me, really. It's just, a lot of times it's the works that I want to do. And that's really about the Lord and not about this life. God in this life has given me everything, and I have nothing to complain about. Certainly, though I see myself also bound, like I said, to my family. This is not a bondage I am not consenting to. I consent to it willingly. And gladly. It's like if I would be happier walking away from it, I might do that. It's not that just because I can walk away doesn't mean I want to, or that I think it would be more enjoyable or more or better for me. You know what I mean? So being stuck in obligations and having to survive is by no means slavery. Having to support a family and not wanting to, feeling like you can't leave is also not slavery. And, unless, it could be, but I mean, it's like, but what I'm saying is the way generally people are saying it is it's not. Because you technically don't have to. Like a lot of the things people think of as slavery is just the obligations of their heart. Like you don't you could go out west and live on the streets where the weather's nice every day and they don't bother you if you put a tent on the median of the road, or whatever. I don't know. It's crazy. Everyone wants to live on a Pacific island where it's temperate all year round. You just walk down the beach and pick up the food off the sand, right? Like some sort of fantasy getaway. Life isn't like that. Knowing that of the Lord you shall receive the reward or the inheritance. So even though a slave is not an inheritor, notice how Paul throws inheritance in there. Because a slave does not inherit. I mean, occasionally they would. Like Abraham talked about, when God spoke to him, he's like, he that will inherit my life is my servant. My servant's set to inherit. I don't have a son. So that happened occasionally, but that was, and of course that would be a very trusted servant indeed, who would inherit like a son. And a lot of times there was that aspect. In fact, in the Old Testament, they had like laws about people being, after soul, you couldn't keep people in slavery for life in the Old Testament. They had, after a certain amount of time, they had to be let go unless they didn't want to go. In which case they would have their ear bored through with an awl. They would have a hole put in their ear pierced to mark themselves as servants. And they could stay. I mean, sometimes people would want to. They loved their families. They didn't know anything else. And if someone was very well treated, you can imagine someone's a child. Here's why someone might like slavery. They're a child, their parents are killed, and they're taken captive in some sort of war battle, and then they're sold off to someone who then takes them to their home, treats them well, expects them to work, and they work, and they do well, and they become close in the family and stuff, and if they're well treated and such, why would they ever want to leave? That's their home. I mean, they might want to go eventually, and maybe they would. Why would they ever want to leave? Well, if they do, they do. But if they don't, they don't. It says not in the Bible, but somewhere else, I forgot who said it, a philosopher or someone, that the slave clings to his chains and must have them struck from him. There is a certain dependency that does arise from being a slave. Because especially if you're not allowed an education, you're not allowed, to better yourself, or you're not given an opportunity to show what your service can be. Masters can be very cruel and wicked. It's not like that. Paul's optimistic point of view is also, part of his time, in which they looked at slavery. Everyone believed in it. It was like ubiquitous. Everyone. In America, you had this whole anti-slavery movement in the North and stuff, and the South, they're trying to justify it, trying to explain it, becoming stubborn, because they have people pushing against them heavily to stop it. And so they become more and more adamant about it. And it contributes to the brutality of it, I have no doubt, because the fight over it. In Roman times, it was less of a question. There was no question. It's like people can be made into property, of course. And and that was how they looked at it. And also so the bettering of that property seemed to be like, well, that's just, if you buy a slave, why not invest in them and make them better? And then if you need to sell them, look, I have this slave. He knows numbers. He can read. He can write. He's very valuable. He may know a trade even. You know what I mean? A lot of times the tradesmen, slaves, were very valuable. Well, this one knows blacksmithing. This one, works with leather. He knows all all everything about leather. He's a tanner. He knows all that stuff. But a slave generally does not inherit. You know what I mean? In the family, is not going to inherit. But of the Lord you shall receive reward of the inheritance. There's a different inheritance. By living your life as if it transcends the small world in which you find yourself. Maybe a slave, maybe whatever. You find yourself in some kind of bondage. Right? And if you live your life as if it transcends that bondage, in that small, tight-packed place where things aren't right and where there's pain and suffering and all the vicissitudes of life, if you look to the Lord and live after the Lord and give yourself wholly to Him and do your labor as though unto the Lord, God sees this. Though your master may not be kind, though your master may not be impressed, God sees all. And He has your back. You serve the Lord Christ, slave or not. They think you're their slave. You're not their slave. You're Christ's slave. You're Christ's slave on loan. And if Christ has given you on loan, Paul says, then obey. And things pertain to the flesh. He's not saying things according to the Spirit. Don't let them tell you to believe or not to believe. You can just resist on that ground till they kill you. But in terms of the reasonable labor of a slave, just do it. And do it well, is what he says. But he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. Whether you're slave or master, king or commoner, you will receive of God for the wrong you have done. Those who, the slave who is obedient will receive inheritance from the Lord. But those that do wrong, whether they're a slave or whether they are master, because that's why he says there's no respect of persons. He's saying, and this is a critical thing that people in the South should have been looking at. That if in using the power to lord it over men's lives like a master, if you use that power and you use it wickedly, if you do wrong, if you hurt and injure, because like I said the example before, you have a young child who's taken captive. Well, what if you have a young child who grows up and his family owns slaves and he's taught it's nothing but right, it's fine, and they trot out the Bible and they show, it's acceptable. And he's raised in this culture that believes it's all right to own other people. But it isn't. But more so, there are other things that we know are right and wrong. It's like you may not understand. Maybe I can buy into someone not understanding that owning people is wrong. In and of itself, it's sinful to try to take possession of another man's life. It's almost like murder. It's somewhere in there. Stealing. Men stealers. Enslavers. When you look to the book of Revelation, when it talks about all the wicked men, it's the enslavers are right there. The kidnappers. They are the most wicked. Among the most wicked. Alright, so they are there. But you can kind of come up in it and be sort of innocent in it. At least, to a certain degree, there's a certain amount of innocent, but they're not innocent in every way. So I say, it's like when they mistreat their servants. When a man mistreats his servants or he is unjust with them. When they work hard for him and he gives them in return scorn and a wicked attitude. And God also sees that. And anyone who does wrong by his servants God also observes that. And they shall receive the reward of what they are inheriting. Now you sow to the wind, you reap the whirlwind, or you inherit the whirlwind. I forgot. I was just thinking of that. There's inherit the whirlwind or inherit the wind. It was like whatever, a book or a movie, I forget. Anyways, where are we time-wise? Okay, we got 20 minutes. We'll go into the next chapter. God, no respect of persons means whether someone is a really important person or a not so important person, the judgment is the same. This really annoyed me when I listened to Norman Geisler try to defend hell once. His view, the traditional view of eternal torment, And one of the things he said in this was that because sins against God are sins against this infinite being, therefore the punishment for them must be infinite. Because just like on the earth, we look at, if someone kills a king, it's a much worse crime than if he kills a hobo or something, or a vagrant. And I was like, that really made my eyes go wide open. I was like, wow, you don't know biblical morality, do you, Dr. Geisler? You don't know much about it at all. And you're a great scholar of Christianity, which I have no doubt you are. But like, man, talk about blindness. The judgment of God is without respect of persons. The crime is, the person who commits the crime is judged on their own. I mean, killing is killing. If you kill a great man or you kill a small man, you're still a murderer. There's no, the idea that God would put a distinction there, like, wow, you killed someone really important. That's bad. Don't you know who he was? Don't you know who I am? I am so-and-so. I'm very important. I mean, isn't that like just a cliche of, you know what I mean? A cliche. That's that cliche that like, oh yeah, don't you know who I am? I'm so important. My name is da-da-da. My father is this and that. Or I've been the most important. You know what I mean? That is respect of persons, saying that I deserve special treatment, different treatment under the law because of who I am and how important I am in some way, or whether I'm related to somebody important. I got some factor in here that means I should not be judged like other men. Should have a different judgment because I sinned, because I'm more important. And obviously, like if someone punches me, well, that's like murdering like a lesser person. If someone insults me, that's like punching a lesser person. You know what I mean? Because everything is judged differently when it happens to me. And that mentality is so wrong. The Bible is very clear about respect of persons. And the idea that then God would judge with respect of persons in respect to himself. I mean, because then in the sense, then there's no, I'm sorry, my glasses are starting to hurt my head. There is no, like, there's no different, that means all sin. Every single one, whether, you got Stalin or Hitler or whatever, you get your big sinner on one end, or it's just grandma on the other, it's all the same. Her offense is as infinite as theirs is. You know what I mean? That's why grandma she'll be slowly frying right next to Hitler. Except she won't know he's there because she'll be totally alone. But that's where it goes. That's where the doctrine goes. I don't agree. There is no respect of persons. The crime is, the punishment fits the crime itself. And you don't take, a murder is a murder. I mean, obviously, if someone murders a head of state, it's a big deal. But the crime itself is no worse than any other murder. I mean, it's a bigger deal in the earth because, like, wow, you killed a leader. It's an assassination or whatever. I get it. There's a certain obvious difference to the crime. Because it's not just a crime against a man, it's a crime against a state or a way of government. Like, I understand that aspect of it. You know what I mean? But the idea that it's a person, you know what I mean? You know. Now, as far as I was going to say, though, like the murder can be different based on, you know what I mean? Like, not their person of who they are, but based on what they are. You know what I mean? Like, someone who murders a murderer is not the same as someone who murders someone who is innocent. That's a different question. That's not respect of persons, of who I am, as far as that goes. Meaning unearned glory, I should say. You know, when we're talking about respect of persons, whether someone's rich, whether they've got, you know, nice clothes, that kind of thing. Obviously, there can be some differences in the crime, like, oh, I murdered a mother and father of a big family, or, you know what I mean, like that's a really heinous thing. Or I murdered someone who murders like a whole family, and someone who murders a terror cell. You know, they find a terror cell and they take it in their hands to do some vigilante justice, right? Obviously, the difference there has to do with justice, though, not to do with persons. You know what I mean? It's a different question. Just want to put it out there. There are different kinds of gravity of crimes, whether they be murders, thieving, adulteries. They are. But it has nothing to do with the persons of the one who is being violated. And that person is limited to like the thought of their wealth and status. You know, not according to their virtue or to their relative innocence or guilt. You know, virtue, innocence, or guilt, that is important. But how a person is viewed to society, or whether or not they're rich or poor, is not. Not according to the law of God. According to the law of God, there's one God, one law. Again, it's about the crime committed, the actual crime committed, not merely about who they are. But there is some factor there, like I said. It's like there is I understand the heinousness of certain crimes when it's against someone who's innocent. Right? Masters, and this is a continuation of the thought, obviously. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. Again, you have a master in heaven. You better, as I said, as he's talking about the respect of persons, he's turning on the masters and saying, hey, be fair. Remember, you also have a master in heaven. You know, and giving servants what is just and equal is not usually what anyone does to a servant, and they're certainly not required to. I mean, a man who owns slaves could just work them and take every bit he could out of them and feed them enough to make sure they survive. Yeah, I mean, just murdering your slaves was not generally considered, you know, I mean, in the South they would argue that because these people were property, they had value. But I mean, when you value lives in terms of dollars and cents, you know what I mean, there are some people who would pay a lot of money to do a lot of awful things to other people. You know, if that's all it costs, if it's just a question of price, you know, just like people pay for prostitutes. You know what I mean? If it's a question of price, there's a certain point at which some people are willing to just pay. You know, if someone has some sort of sadistic desires or nature and wants to hurt people, I mean, conceivably they could just buy people to hurt them. It's not going to be the normal thing. I mean, most people don't want to destroy their investments, but some people are very malevolent that exists out there, especially, you know, when they have power and money and stuff like that, can be very dangerous indeed, very wicked indeed. We have a master in heaven. So we ought to consider how we deal with those who are beneath us, who are our inferiors, our subordinates. You know, some people have said, you know, you judge a person or one way to judge a person is how they treat those who are their subordinates. You know what I mean? Because it doesn't take much of a person morally to fawn over his boss and to kiss butt, as we say, all right? To be real suck up and like, oh, boss. But then they turn on those who are under them, who they have authority over, and mistreat them, abuse them, and otherwise behave badly. Well, and that's the thing, is like, when someone behaves that way, it tells you a lot about them. It tells you what kind of person they are, where they put their values. They don't, because a man who looks to men and is a man pleaser, as Paul says, not as men pleasers, right? He had said that. I didn't really talk about that part. As men pleasers, but in singleness of heart. I'm glad this came up, because I didn't want to skip on the men pleasing part, because that's the thing. It's like, you can always look up and think, I just want to please the person over me. And there are ways you can please them that are not actually good. You know what I mean? Meaning, seeking to obtain their favor often does not result in necessarily the best things. Like a yes man tells the boss, yeah, oh yes, all the time, oh yes sir, just like you say, according as you say, sir, yes, as you, even though in the back of their minds they think he's running the company into the ground. He's going to ruin this farm. And then this house is not going to stand because of this leadership. You know it, but you're just doing it to please men. You know what I mean? And sometimes, and taking the hard stance, sir, and trying to, I care not for it, but I believe it's my obligation. You can get in trouble, telling your boss you think he's got the wrong idea. And if they won't hear it, once you've said it, you've said it. You don't need to pursue it. If it's going to cost you, if you have someone supervising you that just doesn't care themselves, that often happens. That they just don't care. They themselves are men pleasers, pleasing those that are over them. And so you tell them, hey, there's a problem. This is going to go wrong. If we don't change our course, there's going to be difficulty here because, this is a really bad idea we're following. I don't care. This is what is wanted. That can happen. And, for your warning, you can get yourself scorned. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't, when in good conscience, you could warn somebody, even if it's an unkind master. Don't be a man pleaser. Do it as unto the Lord. Speak the truth as God would have you speak the truth. Don't just, because, it's easy to sabotage the master by letting him be stupid. Slaves throughout history have used that technique. Let the master be stupid and let him hurt himself. We'll just keep doing what he says. Yes, sir, we do what you say. You say keep doing it. Yes, sir, we will do it. We'll keep working just like you say, even if it's gonna be a major disaster. Well, you said so. It's like, but you knew. Why didn't you say anything? I did. Oh, yeah, you did. And then maybe something can be changed. So it doesn't, I know many times, like Jesus said, casting your pearls before swine. You speak up, trying to help a situation, and all you get is ripped for it. Sometimes in life that happens, but we should speak up anyways, at least once when necessary. You got to use the Holy Spirit to understand when it's time to speak and when it's time to shut your mouth, right? We always have to contend with the conundrum of where does wisdom lie? Because wisdom is you read some of the Proverbs and stuff in the books of wisdom, there are contradictory things that wisdom teaches. And the key to wisdom is knowing when to use each part of wisdom. When is discretion the better part of valor? And when is hesitation, going to get you lost? When should you look before you leap? And when do you need to go? Because sometimes each one can be wise in its own time. And failure to recognize that, to think there's always just one answer to everything, is what makes people fools. It's one of the things, anyways, right? Makes us foolish. Because we're not able to change. We're not able to flex, to bend. I ever hear phantom noise, I'm like, what is there, a rat? Maybe it was outside. Okay, so we got a couple more minutes. Let's see. Continue in prayer, watch with the same thanks. Okay, you have also Master in heaven. Continue in prayer and watch in the same with thanksgiving. Watch in prayer. There's several places where it says watch in prayer in the New Testament. What does it mean to, like, through prayer? Sorry. To keep watch in prayer. Well, you should pray about the things you're keeping your eyes on. You know, if you're keeping your eyes on things, the things you should be. And we have a lot of idioms that have to do with keeping your eyes in the proper position. Like keep your eye on the ball. We've got to have our eye on the ball. Keep your eye on the prize. You got to have your eye on the prize. We're supposed to have the proper focus in everything. And one of the things that prayer does is it helps you focus yourself properly and orient yourself in relationship to God and the world. It helps you, and it helps in many ways orient the world, your world, and yourself in it. Well, let me put it, orienting yourself in your world with respect to God. And so, in prayer, I look at my situation in the world and I talk to God about it. And I give thanks to Him in the situation I am, but also looking to where is He moving me? What am I to be doing? You know, is this a static position I'm to occupy for a long term, or is there some movement He wants from me? So in prayer, I talk to God, and I also watch for what the Holy Spirit wants to tell me I need to know about where I am right now. You know, I mean, what my situation, you know, if someone is a slave, you know, what God might call them to seek freedom. It's not always that you have to stay a slave, you know, but you do a good enough job and you win the master's heart. Who knows? Sometimes you can't win anybody's heart. So what's next? I'm not saying God would never counsel a man to run away from his slavery. But Paul, even when Philemon, Philemon was the slave master. The book of Philemon deals with, it's a letter to a man delivered in the hand of the slave. And what was his name? Is it Onesimus? I forget his name. Forget the name of the slave. See now, I could just look it up. My brother, or what do you say? It's just the book of Philemon. Or Philemon. Depending on which Philemon. It's written concerning Onesimus. Okay, I had the name already. Never mind. I remembered the name. I just couldn't remember that it was the right one. Onesimus was an escaped slave, and Paul sent him back to his master with a letter saying, receive him now as a brother, as you would receive me. He wanted that person to clear his legal problems. It's not necessarily even that Philemon was like trying to hunt him down. It's just Onesimus said, yeah, I ran away from my master, Philemon. And Paul's like, this one Philemon, where, of what city? And inquiring like, this is a man I know. This is a man I know. And so he sent him with a letter to be reconciled and asked him to be received not anymore as a servant. And in saying he wasn't profitable to you before, but I trust he can be profitable to you now. You know, sending him to become a free laborer with him or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like that he could somehow go back and make things right. with the master and himself, and not return to his former estate of misery in slavery, but rather to sort that out. You know, because in their world, you know, while it might be tempting to say, "Oh, just be free," you know, what I mean, like Paul himself could get into trouble for counseling such things, and also, there's so many other practical and pragmatic ways to get through this and to get along. And it doesn't really matter because our lives are forfeit. You know what I mean? We our lives we've given over to Christ. It does long to be free. I think so. See, I lost my connection, but it reconnected successfully. There may be a little loading there. Okay. And then look at this. Let me just look at this last verse, and we'll probably pick it up with the same verse, but notice what he says. Continue in prayer and watch, and the same with thanksgiving, with all praying also for us, that God would open unto us a door of utterance to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in bonds. I'm also a slave. I'm in bonds. So I was saying, I am in bonds to the gospel of Christ, the mystery of Christ. I am bound because of the mystery of Christ. I have to preach the gospel. So pray that God would open a door of utterance so I could fulfill my obligation as God's slave. You know, Paul often referred to himself as God's doulos, God's slave. I am his slave. I mean, I don't have my own will. I don't have my own desires anymore. I've yielded that all up to Christ. That's how it's supposed to be. Offer your bodies a living sacrifice. You know, he says, servants, obey your masters in the flesh, like you're obeying God. So if you're free, what do you think you're going to be? Well, you're no longer a slave to him. Now you're a slave to God in some other way. You're going to be your flesh is bound up in bondage, no matter how you slice it. A free man must look after himself, and he has to figure out what he's going to do with his life. A slave doesn't have to think about that. Someone else owns him and tells him what to do with his life. I'm not saying that is equivalent. But from a certain perspective, they are. There is an equivalent. Even though they are not equivalent, there is an equivalency. There is somewhat of an equivalence, in that you don't really own yourself. You are not your own master. You think you're free, you're not. And that's what sometimes people, even in our times, they detect that. They detect this a sense of like, man isn't free. Everywhere he turns, he's in chains. You know, and they realize that even as you take off each layer of bondage, it just gives you end up taking on other layers of responsibility, which are themselves bonds. And the greatest bond of all is that which binds us to Christ. Because you are bought with a price. And you will inherit. But you will inherit as an adopted child. But be mistaken about it. Let there be no mistake. You were all sold under sin. And now you are bought with a price, and that's the blood of Christ. We're all slaves to sin. We were all slaves and in bondage. But Christ has made us free. But not made us free that we should just fly off. Thanks. Now, our reasonable service is offer your body. I've saved your soul. I will claim your body. I want you to do in your body everything I tell you to, says God. You're my servant now. I own you. I bought you. I paid for your sins with my son's own blood. And now you belong to me. And I will do with you as I will. And that may end very... that ending, though good, is not always, well, in the world it can be, we all got to die. We're all gonna face death, one way or the other. And so we must forfeit this life, but the end thereafter, the resurrection, in that, yes, there is pleasures evermore in God. There's joy forevermore. There's peace forevermore. But We're going to live by faith and find that. We're not going to find it through, seeking to release ourselves from every obligation. There's no, that kind of freedom is itself a bondage also. Look at people who live in hedonism. They don't find more fulfillment by pleasuring themselves. They find their lives to be as empty as anyone else who has ever given themselves over to the pursuits of the world and trying to find a way to fill their lives. Those things do not fill us. They do not make us whole. Okay. So we'll pick it up in verse 3, which is a transition anyways, right? Because you can see what he's saying. But Paul was also a slave, and that's what we were talking about. So, thanks for joining me this day. I look forward to being back again tomorrow, and Lord willing, have a full slate of studies this week. We'll see. That's all.
For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end. On the throne of David and on his kingdom,